The first thing Vivian Ashford saw when she entered the rehabilitation garden was her paralyzed daughter standing on her own. Not in a wheelchair. Not strapped into some expensive machine. Standing. Her small legs trembled violently beneath her, her fingers gripping a pair of worn parallel bars, while a man in a faded janitor's uniform knelt beside her, one hand hovering behind her back and the other steadying her elbow. Vivian froze so completely that the expensive leather folder slipped from her fingers and landed on the stone path. Her daughter, 8-year-old Elsie, had been told by 3 of the finest specialists in the country that she might never walk independently again. Yet there she was, crying, shaking, and trying to take one impossible step toward a man Vivian barely knew. If you believe that kindness can reach places money cannot, that forgiveness can heal wounds, and that hope deserves one more chance, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to our channel and become part of our community, because sometimes the person we overlook is the very person who changes everything. Vivian had built her life around control. At 39, she was the founder and chief executive of Ashford Meridian, a technology and investment company whose glass headquarters dominated the city skyline. Business magazines called her brilliant, disciplined, relentless, and nearly impossible to impress. She had learned long ago that money could solve almost every problem. Money could bring specialists from across the world. Money could place her daughter in a private rehabilitation center with imported equipment. Money could purchase an entire wing of a hospital if necessary. But money had not bought Elsie a single step. 2 years earlier, Elsie had been a bright, energetic child who loved horseback riding and collected tiny pressed flowers. Then an accident had damaged her spinal cord, leaving her unable to walk. Vivian had spent every day since then fighting as though the world itself were an enemy. She changed doctors whenever progress slowed, bought experimental equipment, arranged private therapy, and pushed Elsie through exercises until the child began to associate rehabilitation with disappointment. Slowly, Elsie stopped asking when she would walk again. Then she stopped talking about walking altogether. That morning, Vivian had arrived at the rehabilitation center expecting to meet a new neurological specialist. Instead, she found something that made her heart nearly stop. The center employed a quiet maintenance worker named Everett Hale. He was 42, a single father raising his 12-year-old daughter, Mara, and he had worked there for nearly a year. Vivian had seen him countless times without truly seeing him. He emptied bins, repaired loose railings, cleaned therapy rooms, and kept the gardens immaculate. His clothes were always clean but worn, his brown work boots permanently marked by years of hard labor. He rarely spoke unless necessary. He never complained. What Vivian had never known was that Everett had once served as a Navy SEAL, spending years in dangerous operations before leaving the military after an injury and the death of a close teammate. He had deliberately chosen a quiet life afterward, believing that if he could give his daughter stability, he would have enough. Elsie had met Everett by accident months earlier. She had been sitting alone near the garden after refusing another therapy session, staring at children walking past her. Everett had been repairing a broken wooden bench. Instead of telling her to be positive or reminding her that she was lucky, he simply sat several feet away and began fixing the bench. He did not stare at her wheelchair. He did not pity her. He treated her as though she were a person who had simply wandered into his afternoon. That mattered more than he realized. Over the following weeks, Elsie began watching him work. Everett noticed that she hated being touched unexpectedly, that she became frustrated when adults praised tiny movements, and that she responded better when someone treated exercises like challenges instead of tests. Because of his military background, he understood balance, muscle control, repetition, breathing, and the importance of rebuilding confidence after the body had betrayed itself. He also understood something the specialists had forgotten: fear could become stronger than pain. Without telling Vivian, Everett began spending a few minutes with Elsie each afternoon after finishing his maintenance duties. He never promised she would walk. He never told her that miracles were guaranteed. He simply taught her how to trust her body again. He started with sitting upright without using her hands. Then shifting weight from one side to another. Then transferring herself from the chair to a support rail. When she failed, he never looked disappointed. When she succeeded, he did not celebrate as though she were fragile. He simply nodded, as though she had completed something difficult and was ready for the next challenge. Elsie began looking forward to those afternoons. Vivian knew none of this. She only knew that Elsie had recently become less resistant to therapy. She assumed the new specialist was responsible. So when she walked into the garden and saw her daughter standing with Everett, she felt a storm of emotions collide inside her. Shock came first. Then fear. Then anger. Her mind immediately imagined liability, unauthorized treatment, and the possibility that this man had endangered her child. She started toward them, but before she could reach them, Elsie lifted one trembling foot. It moved forward less than an inch. But it moved. Elsie almost collapsed. Everett caught her gently and lowered her onto the padded support behind her. Vivian covered her mouth with one hand as tears filled her eyes. Her daughter had not taken a step in 2 years, and the first movement had happened without a doctor, without a machine, and without Vivian standing beside her. It had happened with a janitor. Vivian confronted Everett immediately, but her anger was not truly about him. It was about everything she could not control. She demanded to know what he had been doing with her daughter. Everett did not become defensive. He explained that he had never forced Elsie to do anything and had never claimed to be a therapist. He had simply helped her practice movements that were already part of her rehabilitation program. He told Vivian that Elsie had asked him to help because she trusted him. That sentence struck Vivian harder than any accusation could have. She realized that her daughter trusted a man she had barely acknowledged. Vivian wanted to send Everett away, but before she could make the decision, Elsie began crying. Not from pain, but from fear that Everett would disappear. She reached for his hand. Vivian watched her daughter's fingers wrap around the rough hand of a man who had no wealth, no famous name, and no reason to care about them except compassion. For the first time in years, Vivian wondered whether she had mistaken protection for love. The next morning, she discovered Everett's military background almost by accident. A personnel file had been left in an administrative office after a routine security review. His record showed years of distinguished service and specialized training, followed by an honorable medical separation. But what caught Vivian's attention was a handwritten note from a former commanding officer describing Everett as someone who had once carried an injured teammate for miles despite suffering a serious wound himself. Vivian suddenly understood why Everett never panicked when Elsie's legs shook. He had spent years learning how to remain calm when someone else's life depended on him. But there was something else. Everett had become a janitor deliberately. He had been offered security consulting jobs, private protection work, and corporate positions after leaving the military. He had rejected them because they required constant travel. His daughter Mara had been struggling after losing her mother, and Everett had decided that being present for her mattered more than money. He chose a modest home, steady hours, and work that allowed him to pick Mara up from school every afternoon. Vivian felt ashamed. She had assumed his uniform represented failure. Instead, it represented sacrifice. Yet the greatest turning point came when Elsie suffered a setback. During an afternoon exercise, her legs suddenly buckled. She fell hard against the padded mat and burst into tears. Vivian immediately blamed herself for allowing the exercises to continue. She wanted to stop everything. Everett knelt beside Elsie, but he did not tell her that everything was fine. He acknowledged that it hurt and that being afraid was understandable. Then he reminded her that one fall did not erase every step she had already taken. Vivian expected Elsie to refuse. Instead, the little girl wiped her face and tried again. That moment changed something inside Vivian. For 2 years, she had been fighting to make Elsie walk because she believed walking would prove that the accident had not won. But now she understood that her daughter did not need to prove anything. She needed permission to live without being defined by what her body could or could not do. Vivian began changing. She stopped demanding immediate results from therapists. She started sitting beside Elsie during ordinary activities instead of constantly discussing medical progress. She learned to celebrate independence rather than perfection. Most importantly, she apologized to Everett. Not as a billionaire apologizing to an employee, but as a mother apologizing to a man who had protected her daughter when she had been too consumed by fear to recognize what Elsie needed. Everett accepted the apology, but he also challenged Vivian in a way no business associate ever had. He reminded her that Elsie needed her mother more than she needed another expensive machine. He told her that children sometimes become stronger when adults stop treating them like broken things. Vivian listened. Months passed, and Elsie's progress became undeniable. She could stand longer. She could transfer herself from the wheelchair. She could move several steps while holding support bars. Her physical therapist, who had initially been skeptical of Everett's involvement, eventually admitted that the emotional confidence he had helped rebuild was contributing significantly to her rehabilitation. Meanwhile, Mara and Elsie became close friends. Vivian discovered that Everett's daughter was thoughtful, funny, and fiercely protective of her father. Their friendship helped both girls heal in different ways. Elsie had spent years being treated as someone who needed saving. Mara had spent years fearing that her father might someday leave her because of his dangerous past. Together, they learned that strength did not mean never being afraid. It meant continuing despite fear. Vivian also began seeing Everett differently. At first, she admired his patience. Then she admired his courage. Eventually, she realized she admired the way he loved his daughter. He never used money to compensate for time. He simply showed up. He remembered school projects, packed lunches, repaired broken bicycles, and listened when Mara had a difficult day. He was wealthy in a way Vivian had forgotten how to be. Their relationship grew slowly, carefully, and without either of them forcing it. Vivian did not rescue Everett, and Everett did not save Vivian. They simply began filling the empty spaces in each other's lives. Then came the day nobody at the rehabilitation center would ever forget. Elsie stood at the end of the garden path with a walker in front of her. Vivian stood several yards away, trembling with anticipation. Everett stood beside the support rail. The therapist watched quietly. Mara held her breath. Elsie took one step. Then another. Then another. Her knees shook, but she kept moving. Vivian began crying before Elsie reached her. She wanted to run forward, but she stopped herself because she knew this moment belonged to her daughter. Elsie continued until she reached her mother and collapsed into her arms. Vivian held her tightly, sobbing into her daughter's hair. For years, she had dreamed of the day her daughter would walk. She had imagined doctors applauding, cameras recording, specialists congratulating her. She had never imagined that the man who would help make that dream possible would be the janitor she had once walked past without noticing. Everett watched from a short distance away, smiling quietly. Elsie turned and reached toward him. Everett walked over, and the little girl hugged him as tightly as she could. Vivian looked at the two of them and finally understood the lesson she had been too frightened to learn. Sometimes the person who enters your life wearing the simplest clothes carries the greatest strength. Sometimes healing begins when we stop asking why something happened and start asking what love can do next. And sometimes the greatest miracle is not a body learning to walk, but a heart learning to trust again. Before the story ends, take a moment and leave a meaningful comment telling us what you believe Elsie's journey teaches us about hope, patience, and the people we might overlook. Maybe someone reading your comment today needs those words more than you know. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. Years later, Elsie would still remember the first time she stood in that garden. She would remember the fear in her legs, the tears on her mother's face, and the steady presence of the former Navy SEAL who never once promised her that walking would be easy. He had simply taught her that falling did not mean she had failed. And Vivian would never again measure a person by their title, their clothing, or their bank account. Because the man she once saw as nothing more than a janitor had quietly become one of the most important people in her family's life. He had not given Elsie her legs back. He had given her something even more powerful. The courage to believe that she could use them.